Hi there and welcome. Once again, this is Gina from McGuire and I'm glad you're here. Today I have some bold, almost one layer cards for you that I created with a really fun ink layering technique that I call negative ink layering. The reason I call it negative is we're coloring the negative space. We're not coloring in our images, our stamped images. We're putting the inked layering outside of it. And I have a trick for this that allows you to not have to fussy cut a mask for these different images. I have a few variations in hopes that this encourages you to try this with whatever stamps and stencils and inks you may have. Let's start with this example here. For this, I'm using the new beautiful Altenew Sweet Flower Stamp Set. I'll use this a couple more times in the video because it's so beautiful. What I like about this is the unique flowers, and there is an outline image, the layering images, and you can use them either together or separately. So you can see here on the bottom, the outline and the layering used with the outline. I'm actually not doing the stamp layering today, believe it or not. I usually like to. Today I'm just using the outline. So these are actually pretty quick cards to pull together. I'm starting with a piece of white cardstock and stamping that outline flower with black ink. I'm using my MISTI stamping tool, but you could use a large acrylic block if you prefer. Next, I'm getting out some masking paper. You could use any masking paper for this. If you've watched my videos, you know I really like the Masking Magic from Gina because it holds up really well and you can reuse the masks over and over. Okay, so I ran that through my die cut machine and I'm using the negative space of my mask to center around my stamped image so I can make sure I have it lined up. Then I have removed the release paper from the positive mask. I'm placing it in the opening, then I'll remove the negative space. And now you can see that my mask is covering our stamped image. You can actually see the black stamping through that, so you really don't need the negative space to line it up, but it's handy. Now it's time to do all the ink layering in the background there. We'll do inking, stenciling, and stamping. And I went really bold for today's videos, but you could do soft colors if you prefer. These are the Altenew dye ink colors that I'll be using for this example. You could use any dye inks for this or even distress ink if you wanted to. I'm using two types of ink blending tools today. I have the large ink blending brush from Altenew. You've seen me use this before in videos and it works wonderfully. I like the white bristles. These are great for covering large areas or backgrounds. I have one for each color, but you definitely do not need that. You could just have a couple and just clean them off on a dry cloth in between colors. Today, I'm excited to also use the Altenew small ink blending tools. These are fantastic. These are new. You can get 4 in a pack, and they're just like the big blending tools, but smaller so you can get into tighter areas. I really like them, especially because all of the brush is flat, so you can really get beautiful blending with it. So you'll see me use them in future videos too. So let's start by doing our first layer of inking. I'm using the bigger tool for this since we're covering the entire background. I'm applying some pink, blue, and purple with a light hand to build up the color, and you can see it blends very easily. So I just am randomly applying this. Notice that I turn my hand in both directions. I blend in one direction and then the other. That allows the ink to get evenly up against the mask that we have there. Now the nice thing about using this big brush is you can quickly apply ink and it's easy to overlap the colors. The key to good blending with inks, any dye inks, is to overlap colors. So you can see how I'm going over a lot of that pink with the purple. So when you apply your first color, cover a bigger area than you really want to end up with because you will have overlap. Notice I also pick up the ink on my brush and then dab it off onto my glass work surface. That's so I don't have a harsh amount of ink on my brush when I bring it to the paper. I then can go back to the glass and pick up that ink and apply it. It really helps to make sure you get a very smooth look. Now this time I'm using a bright blue. I wanted to have a few really different colors here. I didn't want it to all go purple, so that's why I made sure that my blue was really bright. I also got a little blob of blue ink over there from my thumb. I just put some ink over it and in the end you'll never see it. Okay, so now I have most of my colors down, but you can see there are some areas the white shows a little bit too much. So I'm just going back to the pink to blend over and around all of the background. That's one of the things I like to do is start with my lightest color, and then build color around it, then go back to the light to kind of blend it all together. The nice thing with this technique, however, is you don't need to do a great job with your blending because we're layering ink on top of it. Now I have a stencil. This is the Leaf Bed Stencil from Altenew. It's a beautiful stencil. I think it's sold out, but I'm sure they'll have it back in stock soon. Now I'm using the smaller blending brush to apply a heavier amount of ink over the ink that's already there. I'm using the smaller blending brush this time so I can get smaller areas of color. So you can see how I put some pink over pink. Now I'm putting some blue over some purple. I'm overlapping the colors in different ways. This allows me to have a lot of variation and interest in the background. When I apply over this delicate stencil, I'm really kind of dabbing the brush. I basically dab and pull the color a little bit. I don't go swirling around like I did when there was no stencil. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So far that's what my background looks like, but we're going to step it up a bit. I'm wiping the excess ink off the top of my stencil, and now I'm using Hero Art's Unicorn White Pigment ink. I pressed my ink pad onto my glass surface because I don't want to get any of my purple or pink ink on my ink pad. Now I'm using a small blending brush that I only use for white pigment ink. This one's designated for that, and I'm just applying some white in different areas in the background. Not over the whole thing, just a few different areas, and it creates a fun highlight look when we remove the stencil. White pigment ink is one of the best inks you can have in your stash, and look how beautiful that is. And it'll get better when we remove the mask. But I thought it would be fun to add a little bit of stamping to the layering. I'm using the Altenew Pinstripe Stamp Set, which I've used many times in videos. And I'm lining my stencil back up with the pattern I've already done. So I didn't need to take it off before, but I wanted to show you what we had so far. So I've lined it back up. I'm putting this into my MISTI stamping tool and also the Pinstripe stamp. This time I'm stamping with white pigment ink, but I don't want to stamp everywhere. So I'm putting a bit of white ink here and there on the background stamp, and I didn't put a whole lot down. I then used that white ink blending brush to soften the edges so there wouldn't be any harsh lines. And now I'll stamp that over our stencil. Well, I did this once, and I realized I didn't put enough ink down. I need more ink on that. So I'm putting it back in the corner there, and I'm repeating the process, but this time I'll be a little more generous with the ink. So you'll see I'm putting it down heavier, but still only in a few areas. Using that blending brush allows me to smooth that out so we don't have harsh lines when we stamp. Okay, so now I'll stamp this, and I'll press very firmly on this, because remember we're stamping over a stencil, so we want to get in the nooks and crannies. And now check it out. Now, in between our leaves, we have some stripe stamping here and there. Not over the whole thing, because that's not what we wanted. I just wanted it in small areas. And when we remove the mask, which is my favorite part, you see the beautiful bold results. Now, I know many of you don't like that white halo around the stamped image. The reason that white halo is there is because we use the coordinating die to create our mask. Well, you could leave it as you see here, or you could do this trick, and it is really easy to do. I just took a marker that was close in color to our background. It's just a purple Copic marker, but you could use any type of marker you want. And I'm filling in that white halo. Now, it's not going to be perfectly smooth with our background because I'm not using all the different inks and such, but it does good enough and nobody will really ever know. So you could leave the halo, or you could fill it in with markers you see me doing here. And I love the results when you fill it in. By the way, do know Altenew has masks available for many of their stamp sets. So if you bought the mask for this set, you could do this trick without having a halo, and you could just have the inked background right up against the edge. But I wanted to show you this for any stamp sets that you don't have a mask available for. Usually I trace this white halo or cover up the white halo with one shade of marker that best blends with whatever I have in the background. But if you wanted to, you could use a couple colors. In the areas where the ink next to it is darker, use a darker color. If it's in a lighter spot, use a lighter color. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time doing this, and it is a lot faster than fussy cutting this stamped image so you don't have that halo. All we have to do to finish this off is add a sentiment. So I'm using the Altenew Simple Roses stamp set. This is a new one, and the sentiments that you can build on this are really beautiful and worked great for this card. I will use some of these images for masking later on in this video. So off screen, I heat set my background. So all that ink is dry. I used an anti-static powder tool, and now I'm stamping the sentiment with Versamark ink and adding white embossing powder and heat setting it. I'm doing "You Are Simply Amazing," and I'm starting with the word amazing. I like to do two parts of a sentiment separate so I can make sure they're up close to each other. So now I can put in "You Are Simply," stamp that with Versamark, add my white embossing powder, and heat set it. I like that bright white sentiment on that bold, colorful background. To finish off this card, I trimmed it down a bit and glued it to a white top folding note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I also added a few gemstones for some sparkle. But other than that, this is a great one-layer card technique. You could do the technique directly onto a white note card if you prefer, and there would be no bulk to it. But you have the look of texture and lots of layering with that inking technique that we did. My next example has a really large stamped image that would take me days to color, so this technique is a real time saver for this particular card. This is the Altenew Hello Hydrangea stamp. This is the stamp set that inspired this video because I loved that large image, but I knew I wouldn't be able to color it easily. So I decided to do the negative ink layering around it. I started by stamping that image with black ink onto a piece of white cardstock, and then I die cut a mask with the coordinating die from the Masking Magic, and I laid it right over the image. I noticed I could see through the masking paper to the black, so I could make sure it is lined up nicely. Now it's time to apply our first layer of ink. These are the blues and purples that I'm using on this card. Now I usually start with the softer colors for this first background layer. And again, I start with the bigger ink blending tool. Now I'm speeding through the ink blending here because the nice thing about this technique is you don't need to do an excellent job with your blending. If you have a hard time with blending or you just aren't happy with the results that you get, try this ink layering technique with another stencil on top and mixing colors. It's very forgiving. So you'll see when I'm done with this first layer, it's not blended very well, but that's okay. When we add more ink on top and that white pigment ink in certain spots, it all works out okay. This time I'm using the Altenew Stripe Builder Stencil. It's a great diagonal stencil. And I'm applying a little bit of ink here and there in different colors once again. This time for the stencil part, I'm using the small inking tool. So I can do small kind of clusters of color here and there. I do make sure that my colors overlap a little bit, but other than that, I really have no rhyme or reason. Now you could use less ink colors than I did if you want. You could in fact do this with just like a purple and a blue and a white pigment ink if you wanted. I just like to use a mix of colors just for more variation. So there you can see the beginning of our inking. Now I'll wipe my stencil clean, wipe off some of that excess ink with a dry cloth. And now it's time for a little bit of white pigment ink. I'm using my small ink blending brush that I have designated just for white pigment ink, and I'm applying a little bit here and there. Not too many, not too much. You don't want to cover the entire thing. Once I'm done, I can remove the stencil and you see the beautiful results we have so far. However, I want to step it up a little bit by adding a bit of stamping over the stencil like we did last time. So I've put the stencil back on top of our inked background, and this time I'm using the Altenew Dainty Swiss Dot background stamp, which you can tell I have used a lot, and I'm lining that up over our inked background and stencil. Once again, I'm putting a little bit of white pigment ink here and there randomly on the stamp, but not over the whole thing. Then I use my little inking tool to kind of smooth it out so there's no harsh edges, and then I press it very firmly. I wanted to have a little more, so I repeated the process. This time I pressed even harder because we got to get those dots of the stamp through the stencil. There we go. We got great results this time, and check out those little dots that we have in the background here and there. They kind of look like they glow against the bold color. Now we can remove our mask and check that out too. Now you could leave this, just leave that halo there, which I think is fine, but I know many people have talked about in previous videos and comments that they don't like that halo look. So what you can do is heat set your background, grab some markers, just 1 or 2, that kind of match your background and fill in that halo. You can do this in minutes, which is a lot faster than coloring in that whole image or fussy cutting that mask so that you didn't have the halo. So it's just another option. There is a mask available for the stamp set from Altenew that you can use for this technique, and then you don't have to worry about the halo. So keep that in mind also. But Altenew is one of the only companies that has masks available. So I wanted to be able to show you what to do with any stamps you may have. For a sentiment, I decided to go simple and use an older Altenew stamp set called Dearest Friend, and I'm using the Love You sentiment. I white heat embossed that on our background. I trimmed the background down and added it to a white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So there's only one layer added to our note card. So this is a very smooth, non-dimensional card. You could add some gemstones if you want, but that's the fun part about this technique is you end up with a very smooth background. Okay, time for another example. In this case, I created a square mask to create kind of a focal point for our leaf image. For this, I'm using the Altenew Grape Leaves stamp set, which I've used in a previous video. It's a beautiful set. You can actually layer the leaves if you want to, but I'm just using one outline image. I also use the Altenew Grape Leaves die set, which includes the coordinating dies for the stamp set and also the outline dies that you can layer with them. So this die set can be used with or without the stamp set. So I use the coordinating die to create a mask for the single stamp that I have stamped at the center of a piece of white cardstock. So I'm covering up my stamped image with the mask. Now it's time to apply lots of ink over this. Now this time I decided to go with some greens and blues, and you can see the different colors here. I usually start with the lighter colors, and then when we add the stencil, I use the darker colors with the smaller brush. I often get asked if you need a different ink blending tool for each color of ink. I do that just to save time with the work that I do. However, you do not need a brush for each color. What I would recommend is having a few. Maybe if you got the set of 4 small ink blending brushes, you could use one of the 4 for white pigment ink, one for pink and red, one for orange and yellow, one for green and blues, and one for purple and grays. Something like that would also work well. You can clean your blending brushes. I never clean mine. If I want to switch colors for whatever reason, I just rub onto a dry cloth until the excess ink is off. Your brush will be stained, but that's okay. You could usually still use it with no problem. So I would start small, and if you find a need to get more, eventually you could add them. But the nice thing about the small brush that you see me using here to put a little bit of ink here and there is that there's 4 in a pack. So you get 4 that way, and they're great for even backgrounds. Okay, so after I finished doing the background there, I'm using this beautiful Altenew woven stencil. And this time I'm coming in with the smaller inking tools and applying a pretty crazy amount of different colors to this background. So I'm using a lot of different areas of blues and greens and teals just to get a lot of variation. A lot of the background is showing here, so I wanted to have a lot of interest to it. I just have that one small, simple stamped image at the center. I also wanted to mention that you see me using the bigger brushes for bigger areas and the smaller brushes for smaller areas. However, you could use the small brushes for big areas and the big brushes for small areas. If you don't blend much, there's no need for both, but if you do a lot of blending like me, it's really handy to have. Okay, so now I'm coming in with a little bit of white highlight here or there, which I feel is like the way to make this technique really come alive. So I'm putting white here and there with that white inking tool. Again, I kind of dab over a stencil instead of swirl too much because I don't want the stencil to move, or if it's a dainty stencil, I don't want it to shift and mess up my pattern. Okay, so now it's time to remove our mask and check out how beautiful that is. However, I thought it'd be fun to step it up because that's what I do. So I have another piece of masking paper here. This is cut to the same size as my background, and I have a square die that I am just taping towards the top center of the masking paper, and I'll run it through my die cut machine. I'll use this square mask on my card. I'm using the negative piece just as a holding place here. So I'm just holding it there, then putting the positive piece into the open window, and then remove the negative space. I'll save that negative space mask for another technique that I plan to try on my own later on. Now over this square mask, I'm just applying a little bit of white pigment ink. So I'm using my big white pigment ink blending brush here and applying it over the edge. I just want there to be a soft glow around that square mask, very subtle. So you can see it there. I like to use a dry cloth to kind of blend it out so it softens it a bit. Then you can remove the square mask and you have this soft halo around your mask. Another alternative would be to put a darker color ink so it was darker around the frame. Okay, the last step for this background is to fill in that halo. In this case, I used one marker for the entire outside edge of this. And I noticed here that my two caps are mixed up. This is YG09, the other cap says YG06, so that means I've got another one messed up somewhere else. But anyways, I did only use one green marker around the edge, and it's really not that noticeable. To finish it off, I white heat embossed Sending Lots of Love onto a black piece of cardstock. That sentiment is from the same Grape Leaves stamp set. And I also added a few little pearls onto the leaf just for a bit of dimension because that's usually what I like to do. So you can see how there's a little bit of a glow around that square, which adds a little bit more interest to this very simple design. Okay, it's time for my favorite card of the bunch. I used that same stamp that I used at the beginning of the video. I stamped on the center of white cardstock, die cut a mask, which I could have reused the one from earlier, but I completely forgot about it. So keep in mind if you make multiples to reuse that mask. Now over this, I'm applying a pretty heavy and dark amount of ink on the first layer. Because when I do the stencil layer, I'm only adding white ink. So I want to start with a darker or more bold layer of ink on this first one. So I used Ruby Red towards the center, and then next to that I used a little bit of Coral Bliss. And then in the corners I used a little bit of Magenta. And then just on the ends I used a little bit of Warm Sunshine. So I did this first soft layer, then I decided I wanted to go more bold, and I just went back and added more ink on top of that. So you can really start light and smooth and build up the ink. If you try to go bold right from the get-go, chances are you'll have a harder time doing your blending. I wanted to stamp dots over this entire piece. So I put a sticky mat into my MISTI stamping tool, so the sticky side is facing up. I link below to the one I like. I have my dot stamp in my MISTI. I lined up my inked background on it so our dots are lined up straight. Flip the MISTI closed upside down, flip it back over, and now my inked piece is stuck to the sticky mat temporarily, so we can stamp on it and it'll be straight. I stamped with the magenta ink, and now I'm just wiping the excess ink off of the mask, and then I'll heat set that. We can move on to the stencil, and I'm using the Altenew Mighty Corner stencil, which is one of my favorites, and I'm lining it up behind it so that the pattern is lined up straight down the center. This time I'm only applying white pigment ink. So I have my small white blending brush and I'm applying the ink. Notice I kind of dab it and I go back and forth along the stripes here so that the stencil doesn't move. You could spray the back of your stencil with a temporary adhesive, but my background is inky and so it doesn't really want to stick. So I find this works just fine. Once I'm done, I can remove the stencil. Then I flip the stencil over so that I ink on the other half of my card. So I have an overlapping pattern, which is a really fun way to use this stencil. Once again, I'll just apply white pigment ink. If you wanted to, you could add darker ink here instead, but that white creates a fun kind of glowing highlight on the end result. Now we can remove the stencil, and by the way, I just washed my stencils in the sink, and there we can remove the mask, which is just like the magical part of it, and I love that result. Now you could leave it as is with that little white halo around it, or you can go in with the markers. For this one, I went in with R22, RV17, and a little bit of YR04. So they're basically a peach, a pink, and an orange marker. But you, again, could just use one marker all the way around. Don't spend any time trying to do any kind of really great matching, and no one would ever know. For sentiment, I used the Altenew Bold Thanks die. So I die cut the shadow from white cardstock and the word from black. For a little sentiment strip underneath, I used the Leaf Canopy Stamp Set, which I have used a lot. You can tell that's a very loved stamp set. And I white heat embossed on black cardstock. And then I finished it off with just a few iridescent gemstones. So this background has inking, then stenciling, and then stamping. And I really like that result. And it really doesn't take that long to do, especially because you don't need to take a lot of time to do that ink blending, because the layering makes it forgiving, much faster than coloring in an image. Okay, now for this example, and this one I had a lot of fun with the stencil. I wanted to show you how to create a unique look. I once again used the Altenew Simple Roses stamp set. Earlier I just used the sentiment. This time I'm using 2 leaves and a small flower image. I stamped those with black ink to create kind of a border on the bottom of a piece of white cardstock. I used the coordinating dies to die cut several masks from masking paper, and I'm lining them up over our stamping so that each is covered. This time I'm spending very little time ink blending. I am instead putting down a heavy amount of 3 colors. I have fuchsia, coral bliss, and warm sunshine. I just make sure that all of my colors overlap so that it has somewhat of a blended look, but you'll see it's not perfect. We don't need our blending to really shine here because we will be doing more inking over it. You can even see I have a line there at the top. No worries. Now I have the Altenew Bubble Wrap stencil. This is a beautiful stencil that I've used many times. And over this, I'm going to put different inks and different dots. That's one of the advantages of a small blending brush like these. I'm putting a little bit of ruby red over some of the dots. I'm putting fuchsia over other dots. I'm putting a little bit of an orange over other dots, and then white pigment over other dots. No rhyme or reason, just putting a dab of color over each. It doesn't take long, and by doing the variation, you get a really unique look in the end. So again, this is one of the great advantages of using a smaller inking tool. By the way, if you don't have any blending brushes, but you have other ink blending tools, you can definitely try that with the technique that I'm sharing today. Okay, once I've applied ink over each of the dots, or at least I think I have, I'll remove the stencil and end up with some beautiful results in the background. Then we can remove our mask. That's where the magic happens, and you see the fun pattern along the bottom. You could leave the halos as is, or you can color them in with markers or colored pencils, whatever you want. I decided to color mine in very simply and quickly. I trimmed my background down and added it to a white 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card. And then I used the Altenew Simply the Best stamp set to stamp Your Friendship Means the World to Me with black ink. So you can see with just a few colors of bold ink, some white pigment ink, a stencil, and a stamp set, you can create some really unique looking backgrounds. And I did go very bold today, very bright, but you could do softer colors if you wanted. I even think it'd be fun to do backgrounds like this with fall colors. Next, I just wanted to show you a completed card and show you another option. This uses a lot of the products that I've already used in this video and the same techniques. But instead of using a color marker to color the halo, on this one, I did a gray marker to color it. So it almost looks like a shadow around it. So I used C4 and C1 to do this. And this time, my stamped image there, it's not stamped with black ink. Instead, I silver heat embossed it. So it has a bit of a different look. I do believe the gray marker looks better around a black stamped image like I've been doing in this video, but I wanted to show you silver heat embossing also. To finish it, I added it to a white note card, and I used the Altenew Hugs and Hello die set to create that hello die cut. And then I stamped Thinking of You onto a white cardstock strip and added that on top. So this is a bit of a different look. The outline of the stamp stands out more because I use gray. And I do think it does look better if you stamp your image with black ink, but I wanted to show you this variation. Now before we go, I did want to share with you one thing. Now remember how I said Altenew has masks available? I thought it'd be fun to show you it. So this is the Simple Roses stamp set that I showed you. They have the coordinating dies available, which I use to create my masks, but they also have the mask set available, which includes a negative of all the shapes and the positive, and it lines up perfectly with the stamp outline. So keep that in mind if you are considering any Altenew stamp sets, but you can always create your own masks if you prefer. Okay, I hope you will try these techniques of creating an ink layered background with the negative space. It's really fun and a great way to kind of change up your images that you normally would color. If you are interested in the supplies that I use, I always provide a link below along with a visual supply list. And in the middle here, I have a couple other videos that have creative ways to use masking. I've been on a masking kick lately. I appreciate you visiting today, and we'll see you again very soon. Again, very, very soon with another video.